Just give it.
It's not published, it's sent round to friends and people who are interested. And I brought about another 6 with me, if people want them. If people
right, so you'd like to keep them with you?
Yes.
Okay.
Should we leave our seats or? Yes, absolutely.
And where are we going now?
We'll go into the auditorium. On Thursday the 30th, and then we will go on to the Khushwant
Sorry, sir.
Yeah.
Have you got a card?
Brilliant.
Yeah, so this is
Hi, very good to meet you. Hello, hi, very good to meet you.
and that's son Ben. And he's a terrific speaker. That's my son Ashwin.
You're speaking to Raymond.
Not really, no. I'm just moderator. I believe I'm the commercials for cremation.
Yes.
Yeah, for the audience to if you prefer, otherwise we can just start.
I can talk for 10 minutes.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Exactly. Does let itself
Okay. I'm very happy to do that.
I knew about him.
Very
Yes, in this room.
Singh would like to say a few words of welcome. So, my wife had warned me to speak softly when we were together, and then we're pleased we've turned it on.
It's not only me, Carl.
Okay, can you hear me, everybody?
Now you can. No. Yes.
Now you can. Okay. Well, welcome everybody this afternoon. We just driven down from London. I'd just like to briefly thank Dr. Yusuf Hamied, Yuku, as he's known by his friends, for really helping us organize this literary festival, the Cambridge part of the literary festival. We had 2 days at SOAS in London just a few days ago. But this festival here is thanks to Dr. Hamied and of course Lord Simon MacDonald, the master of this college. I had no idea that Charles Darwin actually came from this college, and I've been shown around the Darwin room and the courtyard and all that. And Jagdish Chandra Bose, I had no idea. He was a famous Indian scientist who should have got the Nobel Prize, but didn't. But he also was from this college. So, okay, I'll now hand you over to Fakir Ijazuddin, who's was a close friend of my father's, and he'll probably talk a little bit about my dad, and welcome everybody here. Thank you.
Brilliant. So we connected? Okay, well, I'll start. Brilliant. Thank you so much indeed. And which one? Because this one or this one? This one. Okay. Middle one or right one? To the right. Brilliant. Sat Shri Akal, Bismillah Ar-Rahman Rahim. Good afternoon. And all the non-denominational people can choose their own greetings. Let me begin by remembering the progenitor of the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival, my mentor and yours. Khushwant Singh, he spent the best part of the first 99 years of his life healing our fractured world. He brought religions together. He bridged the divide between countries that should never have been pitched against each other. He used scriptures, prose, and poetry to remind us of the universality of man. And words were the instruments he used to fulfill his mission. His son, Rahul Singh, and Nilufar Bilamoria, and various members of the KSLF have over the years promoted Khushwant's mission in various locations, and today it is here for the first time at Cambridge. Who, when visiting New Delhi, did not want to be photographed with Khushwant Singh? I confess I did. My earliest photograph of him is with his son-in-law, Ravi Dayal, taken in 1981, in the portico of the Sujan Singh complex, where Khushwant had a ground floor flat. My wife Shahnaz and I met him again in the late 1990s, and thereafter whenever we visited New Delhi. My last meeting with him was on the 4th of March 2014, a fortnight before he died. He sat in a wicker chair, his legs outstretched in the sun and the rest of his body in the shade. He wore a grey tracksuit and had a black woolen cap on his head, and I noticed that he had some biscuit crumbs in his beard. He recognized me in an instant. I gave him a copy of my book, The Resourceful Fakirs, on my ancestors who had served at the court of Ranjit Singh. Describe it for me, he said, and I began. And he said, no, now write it in Urdu. And he demonstrated, as if I could ever forget, that he was a master. He had mastery of Urdu and Persian by reciting couplets of Iqbal's. You know that I'm 99 years old? I replied, well, may my years be added to yours. He looked up at me with the softest expression and said, no, but may you should live as long as I have. I held his hand, the hand that had spent a lifetime writing books and inimitable articles, and kissed it. He brushed his cheek with mine, but both of us knew that it was a farewell. He asked me to have his ashes interred in his birthplace in Hadali, now in Pakistan. Khushwant died exactly 10 years ago, on the 20th of March 2014. A fortnight after his cremation, I returned to Delhi to condole with his daughter Mala. She took me into his sitting room, and there, next to his favorite chair, lay my book, waiting to be reviewed by him. Khushwant died, and Mala and her daughter then gave me an urn containing his ashes. And looking at it, I recall the words of the Roman Emperor Septimus Severus. Little urn, you will soon hold all that will remain of him whom the world could not contain. Khushwant's final journey was like the title of his brilliant book, By Train to Pakistan. I took the Shatabdi Express to Amritsar and then walked across the border at Vaga. Khushwant had no problem crossing the border. Ashes do not need visas. His ashes were grouted in the wall of Khushwant's first school in Hadali. The inscription ends with a line from Khushwant's memoirs. And you see, this is where my roots are. I've nourished them with tears of nostalgia. A year later, Rahul, Mala and Nilufer were able to visit Hadali, the home Khushwant never forgot and had nourished with tears of nostalgia. Some years ago, the BBC invited me to speak about the future of the Commonwealth. I asked them, how much time do I have? Oh, they said about 5 minutes. So I said, well, that just about summarizes the future of the Commonwealth, doesn't it? Well, today we have a couple of hours in which to heal the world, which is the theme of our conference. To help us do that, we are fortunate to have with us 4 distinguished discussants. Our host here at Christchurch, Lord Simon MacDonald, a prolific author and journalist, Keshav Guha. Noreen Masood, who is a lecturer in English literature at the University of Bristol, and Amit Roy, an erudite journalist and editor-at-large in Eastern Ireland. Let me quickly remind you, for those of you who have not read the brochures, about Lord Simon MacDonald. Simon MacDonald, Baron MacDonald now, is a former diplomat who is a permanent Under Secretary at the Foreign Office, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and former head of the diplomatic service. His first book, Leadership, Lessons from a Life in Diplomacy, culled from his experience over almost 40 years in the diplomatic service. During that time, Lord MacDonald worked for 4 permanent Under-Secretaries, 12 senior ambassadors, 6 foreign secretaries, and 5 prime ministers. Not only that, but also a partridge in a pear tree. He's been the master of Christ College, Cambridge since 2022, and KSLF is deeply grateful to him for hosting this particular seminar here at Cambridge. This afternoon, he'll be in discussion with Keshav on his latest book, Beyond Britannia, Reshaping the UK Foreign Policy. With his permission, I'm going to quote Lady Thatcher, who mentioned in her memoirs that a Britisher happened to be walking, a foreigner walking down Whitehall, and he stopped a Britisher and said, "Excuse me, on which side is the Foreign Office?" To which the Britisher looked startled and he said, "Well, I hope on ours." Lord Simon, it's for you now to tell us which side you were on. Keshav is a writer of fiction and literary political journalism. Born in Delhi in 1990, he has an AB in history and politics from Harvard University, an MA in creative and life writing from Goldsmiths, University of London. A regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal, Hindustan Times, Die Welt, and other publications. His new book, The Tiger Shore, will be published by John Murray in early 2025. So with that, Keshav, may I hand over to you?
Thank you, Ejaz, Rahul, Nilufer. It's a real privilege to be here to talk about Lord MacDonald's new book. Still newish book, Beyond Britannia. This country does have a pretty distinguished tradition of diplomat writers. And this is very much not just a book for diplomats of foreign policy, but it's a really beautifully written book. It's the only book about British foreign policy that you could confidently recommend to fans of William Dalrymple, because it's full of these lovely historical digressions and which we sometimes go on for pages. You could tell how much I think you enjoy writing them. So what we're going to do is that Lord MacDonald is just going to speak for a few minutes, laying out what the book is all about, and then I'll ask him some questions, and then there'll be some time for audience questions at the end. So,
very good. We're closely coordinated. So first of all, welcome to Christ College, to my college, and particularly welcome to Dr. Hamied. I think in every way possible this event could not happen without Dr. Hamied, because he was the man who suggested that the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival should come to Cambridge, and we are meeting in his theatre, the Yusuf Hamied Theatre, so thank you. And now, looking at my book, the second book, I have to start with the first book, and that is not only that I hope people in the audience might consider getting both, but when I wrote my first book, I advisedly showed it to my best friend. The point about best friends is they tell you the truth. And he read it, and at the end he expressed disappointment, because it was not about foreign policy. It was about leadership. It was about things that I'd observed in the organization where I worked, but the business of that organization I kind of left to one side. So best friends also get you moving, and I decided I had to fill the gap. And so I wrote a second book about foreign policy. By this time, I had retired from the Foreign Office, so I was freer to write what I wanted rather than what I was professionally required to do. Although, of course, we still have a process of clearing our work through the Cabinet Office, so there were one or two sections that had to be modified because they were too adventurous, but I'll just leave that out there. And as I was looking at the foreign policy challenges for the United Kingdom right now, I was struck that they fell into two basic categories. One was very traditional. One was about geopolitics, about relations between states, and about how states organize themselves. And in a relatively short book, I concentrated on two big geopolitical challenges. One is the war in Ukraine. Remember, I'm a Brit, so I'm conscious first of the European continent and the resurgence of Russia as a threat to the rest of the continent. And there, very briefly, my conclusion is that we have to lock arms, that this is a fundamental challenge to global order, to European order, and the rest of the world, I believe, needs to aid Ukraine in defending its independence. This has been in the balance, frankly, this year, but I think the recent decisions in the US Congress mean that Ukraine has a better chance of defending itself successfully. The second big geopolitical challenge I look at is China. Many people in looking at the book have called it the threat of China, but I'm determined not to see China as a threat. I don't think China is necessarily a threat. It might be, but it sure as hell is a challenge to the rest of the world. And there I believe that we need a relationship, we need a constructive relationship, but we need a relationship where we don't allow the Chinese to dictate terms. That if China dictates terms, then everything is done their way, and we are pushed ever more to the margins. I think we will find ourselves diminished if China is rampant. So that was the first half, the familiar changes. But remembering the inspiration of the progenitor of this festival, thinking about healing the world, it seems to me that the other challenges we face are less traditional but more important. And they are the challenges of technology and the planet itself. So technology is always felt to be threatening us. I mean, the Luddites in the 18th century didn't like the spinning jenny. They didn't like the first mechanization, and we kind of survived that. And so it has been repeated over the last 200 years. But the latest wave, with artificial intelligence and quantum computing, is discomposing us more than ever. And here I think governments need to take a more forward role. That these new technologies are in need of regulation. Not everybody agrees with that, but I think if there is no regulation, there is a greater threat. But bigger even than technology are the challenges around the planet itself. We all have heard of climate change. A lot of the people in this room are visiting from India, and this year in India, in Delhi, you have experienced temperatures like never before. And these are not unique. These are events that are becoming more and more common and will get worse in time. So the need to address climate, I think, is overwhelming, but also the diminution of biodiversity. This is the College of Darwin. We see his portrait on the wall. He was the one that noted the richness of the natural world, the interdependence of the natural world. And what human beings are doing is overwhelming the rest of the natural world. So it seems to me that diplomats need to acquire new skills and a new focus. Because as well as coping with the traditional and familiar, we also have to address the new and existential. And the clock is ticking. These are big challenges, and if we don't start now, it will only get more difficult later. Thank you very much.
So the book has a starting off point, which is the 24th of June, 2016. Probably don't need to. Some of us would probably like to forget, but obviously, from the perspective of the themes of the book, you can't. And I was reminded of the kind of previous starting point for discussions of Britain's place in the world has always been 1945. And one of your predecessors as Permanent Secretary, who took that job in 1945, Orm Sargent, wrote a memo in that year called Stock Taking After VE Day. It's quite a remarkable document to read. And he said in the future, there are going to be three superpowers: the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire. And he said, well, we obviously can't compete with them militarily or economically, but we'll find other ways. For example, leading through our values, intervening to promote democracy. It's all in there. And as you can read in Beyond Britannia, of course, history panned out quite differently. And one of the striking things about this book is it takes decline. It doesn't treat decline as an issue. It treats decline as a given. It sort of assumes that we've had 80 years of decline. What happens now? And it's almost like you can finally move on from that whole theme of greatness and decline and those ways of thinking. And firstly, I wonder if you think that's fair. And secondly, do you think that is it beyond yourself? Is this now more widely accepted?
The answer to your final question is no. But it's very interesting, because I don't disagree with any of your characterization. But one word in there is very problematic for most British audiences. Brits find it very difficult to accept that what has happened in the last 80 years is decline. And even though you can prove it with any number of statistics, it still feels like a disagreeable and rejected narrative inside the United Kingdom. So although I don't reject what you said, I couch it in a slightly different way. And it's not decline, it's a shift in the emphasis of our possible power. You've got to use the material you have. And in 1945, the United Kingdom was one of the preponderant hard power players. So we had a huge army, we had a huge empire, and we had the biggest navy, and we saw ourselves themselves in these hard power terms. And I would say that those who still see us in those terms are rather nostalgic for an era that has passed. Instead, in the 21st century, I think our power is much more soft power. So it goes to what Orm Sargent was talking about, is the power of example and attraction, the power of education and culture, of coming up with solutions that apply more widely than inside the United Kingdom. But it is not about forcing other people to do what you want, which was how the British Empire operated through 200 years. And now it is much more persuasive and inclusive rather than dictating terms.
I think the only issue is the flip side. Your last point is crucial, because another part of today's context is we're not talking about, we've kind of moved from talking about the decline of British power to the decline of the West. And I was thinking in the context, a very different example of healing the world, which is, just a few years ago, Dr. Hamied's battle to open up access to AIDS drugs in Africa, and coming up against sort of Western emphasis on intellectual property regimes, or as opposed to the actual health needs of large populations. And it's just one of many instances where, from the perspective of what we now call the Global South, Western values have been challenged, sometimes legitimately.
But also, the world has changed. So the late Queen was born in 1926, and when Elizabeth II was born, there were fewer than 2 billion people on planet Earth. By the time she died 2 years ago, there were 8 billion. So we have seen this enormous growth in the population and in demographics, and all of it has been in the Global South. Europe is no bigger in population terms compared to 100 years ago. And so there are consequences of this shift in demographics. And part of why Brits find it difficult to think, well, we've declined, is you look around the UK, and by most measures, it is better than it used to be. So you think, well, how could we be retreating when life here is better than half a century ago? And the answer is that the rest of the world has moved forward at a much more rapid pace. One of the most interesting facts revealed in this election campaign was a reminder from David Lammy, and he recalled that when Labour last came into power in the UK in 1997, the UK economy was bigger than China's economy and India's economy combined. In 2024, India's economy is bigger than the UK economy, and China's economy is 5 times the size. So this is a massive shift. So it's the relativities that I think we should also be aware of.
You mention of the election campaign brings me to something else that struck me when I was reading the book, which is that one of the things you don't dwell on is the relationship between foreign policy and domestic politics. And of course, 24th June 2016 was an example of how domestic politics can shape foreign policy, even when even when there's a consensus within government that is in the other direction. And so one of the things I liked about the book is that you are actually quite radical in some of your prescriptions. I think you do say a lot of things that you probably couldn't have said when you were still in the diplomatic service. But so two of his suggestions, shall we say. One is the Security Council reform, where you say, look, Britain and France clearly no longer should be part of 5 permanent members. France should be replaced by the EU, and Britain and Russia should take turns, 2 years on, 2 years off. And another one is you want to take things very seriously about Britain's nuclear deterrent. And you have a kind of sober cost benefit analysis of what it actually means in 2023 or 2024. But I was thinking, well, I wonder what would happen to the party that put it in their manifesto. And I was reminded of Jared Kaufman's line that the 1983 Labour manifesto was the longest suicide note in history. And I thought, well, this one might rival it.
Well, a few points, because you have alighted on the two most controversial things that I put in the book, and you're absolutely right that no serving official would suggest either of these things. But I'm not a serving official, so I could put some personal belief and argumentation. Taking them in turn, the Security Council is the key part of the United Nations, which is the key international organization. It's a very imperfect organization. It's clearly not functioning the way the Founding Fathers intended, but it's absolutely the best we've got, and it's very unlikely to be replaced by something brand new. So we have a global organization that can't be replaced but is in great need of reform, and I think there's some pressure on us as part of the problem to come forward with suggested solutions. I say we're part of the problem because in 1945 we were one of the victors, and as one of the victors we were one of the authors. And of course we were thinking of our own interests, and we were thinking very much in those times, in the 1940s. 80 years later, the United Kingdom is not the power it was, and so I don't think can continue to demand the role of 80 years ago. But I don't think we are irrelevant in the wider world, and as I've already said, I think our offer is still valid even though it is different from before, but there needs to be some adjustment. And the same applies to France, and I think the same applies to Russia. And at the same time, I think we need to maintain the efficiency of the council, and numbers matter. So the laziest thing to do with the reform is just to expand. And the Security Council has expanded once, and it could easily expand again, and you could have 20 members or 30 members, but I believe if you had a membership that large, it wouldn't do anything. It would find it very difficult to function. I just look at the European Union. The European Union, when it had 15 member states, functioned pretty well. Now it has 27. It's kind of bogged down. So I think maintain 15 and redivide how that 15 is composed. Now, of course, the French hate the idea that they would give up their seat for the European Union, but for goodness sake, the European Union has an external action service. It is increasingly the focal point of member states' foreign policy. So this feels to me a thing to introduce into debate, even if it takes the longest time to happen. The other effect of that will be to take away those seats which other EU member states habitually get in the Security Council, which distorts things towards Europe in a way which I don't think is justified. Yoking the UK and Russia was very sort of punchy, and of course people hate it. But the reason is to make us think. We can't justify keeping things as they are. I don't think Russia can. So getting us in a relationship with each other, might have beneficial effects elsewhere. It's not that we would be following the same line, but we need to be very much aware of the other's line if we were alternates on the council. So I have no expectation that this will happen, but I do know that reform is necessary, and this is just an impulse to debate that. Nuclear is even more controversial than the Security Council. And my starting point is my contention that the British nuclear deterrent will never be used. So I know I've dealt with the margins of nuclear policy all my career, and that is my personal conclusion, at variance with the government's conclusion for sure, but I think, can anybody imagine when it might be used? And nobody that I know respect has come up with an answer to that. Second thing is, the British nuclear deterrent is not in any serious way independent, although that is always claimed. And I can prove it's not independent because its continued existence depends on the continued generosity of the United States. If the United States were not doing what they are doing for the British nuclear deterrent, it would not exist. So how can we regard ourselves as an independent nuclear player? At the same time, it is enormously expensive. It costs more than £10 billion a year. So again, I think this is a moment when you should step back and think, is this the best way to spend a large amount of money? Even if it's defence is the only subject on the table, is this the best way to defend ourselves? My hope is that as an ex-official, this can sort of help those in politics who want to have this conversation. I know that in our election campaign already, the Labour Party has absolutely committed itself to the nuclear deterrent, to the way of defending ourselves right now, because they fear this is one of their weak points in their offer to the electorate. The electorate assumes the Labour are flaky on defence, whereas if they can point out, well, this retired official is saying something similar, it might help them shift.
Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote an essay called The State of War, where he contrasted, talking about national interest, he contrasted real interest with apparent interest. And he said that princes, this is the 18th century, so the world of princes act based on apparent interest, and so they're looking to increase the size of their armies and take over territory, etc. But the real interest of countries is very different. And I think implicit in your book is a similar argument, that it looks like it's not in Britain's interest to give up a B5 seat or a nuclear deterrent, but you actually explain in some detail why it is. Yeah. I just come back to politics and think, well, how are you ever going to get this through the electorate and then the House of Commons? You mentioned that I think you say every foreign secretary you've ever met or ever worked for has quoted you Palmerston's line about permanent alliances, no permanent alliances or enemies. And do you think it's fair to say that one of the arguments of your book is that there might be permanent friends, but you don't actually believe in enemies? You said that China you wouldn't call it a threat. And even Russia, although you advocate quite strongly for helping Ukraine, you're at pains to say Russia is not an enemy, they have to be dealt with sensibly, decently, etc.
No, I think that's a really good way of putting it. I don't believe in enemies. I think in any group like this, however disparate their interests as they come into the room, if you have a good enough conversation, if the atmosphere is constructive, you can establish commonalities, even if you think you're from countries that have nothing in common. And I think that's one of the functions of diplomacy, to bring people together, to make them realise that what unites them is more important than what divides them. And that's why I lay such emphasis on the second part, on dealing with technology, dealing with planetary issues. These are issues that every country, every person has to deal with. So the idea that some of our enemies, I don't think is helpful in that context. I don't believe, but of course you look at what is happening in Gaza right now, or Somalia right now, or Ukraine right now, and of course this is still observable, provable, that lots of people disagree with me. But I think a dispassionate, educated, cool look means that this is an idea whose time has kind of passed.
To another theme of the book, or section of the book, which is about international organizations, and one that you don't spend much time on, and this also links back to Ejaz's opening remarks, is the one that's in the name of your former department, the Commonwealth. Now, to the British policymakers of the 1940s, the Commonwealth was something that they hoped would be very important. One of the big decisions that was taken in the 40s was to expand the Commonwealth to include countries, beginning with India and Pakistan, that would not keep the king, and then they ordained the Queen as their head of state. But the Commonwealth, I think, at least from the British perspective, seems to have turned out to be a bit of a disappointment. And when Britain finally joined what was then the EEC, Edward Heath said in Parliament that one of the reasons we have to do this is the Commonwealth never actually amounted to a serious economic alliance.
There you're introducing the key word, economic. Because the Commonwealth, I think, is a part of soft power. It's a part of people-to-people relations, and I think is useful as such. I think anything that brings disparate people together has a use. And the CHOGM meetings are a chance for a quarter of the world's leadership to get together in an informal, close setting every 2 years. And this, that's the meat and drink of diplomacy. That's a good thing. But the Commonwealth members have too little in common to be a coherent economic grouping. It was a hope, but it did not happen. And Macmillan, realizing it was never going to happen, was part of the motivation for his government applying to join the EEC.
But maybe to be slightly provocative, and to come back to actually Sargent, when India was applying to join the Commonwealth and they said we were going to become a republic, there were a number of people, including Sargent, who said, we shouldn't do this. Let's just have a club of Britain, Australia, New Zealand and Canada, white South Africa as it was then. We'll have much more in common. Do you think a club like that could have worked?
But in some spheres it does exist. I mean, the closest is Five Eyes.
Yeah.
So the intelligence community does organise itself in that way, with the crucial addition of the United States. One feature of diplomacy in the 21st century is there are more and more informal groupings, driven by subjects, driven by a little bit of sentiment, driven by a crisis. So you have contact groups and you have these informal other groupings. I think fine. In the end, it's somewhat inefficient because you have so many different groups dealing with so many different issues that it's hard to keep track. But better those informal groups than people not talking to each other at all.
So, your book when exactly was it published?
End of last year.
Yeah. So it was written and presumably went to press before October 7th.
Indeed.
Which is why it has. I think, and if it was being written now or updated now, it would obviously have. I think would address that question as well. But it seems to me that the crisis, the all-in crisis in Gaza, offers an example of an opportunity for Britain on the terms of your book. I'm not sure, and I don't need to draw you into observations on current government policy, but one that I don't think it appears that Britain is necessarily taking. But in a crisis like this, I mean, how might Britain put into
what is happening in Gaza is simply a tragedy for everybody involved. One of the distressing things for me is that very quickly in the public debate and the international debate, people have been forced into one camp or the other. You're either completely pro-Israel or you're completely pro-Palestinian, and if you are in either of those two camps, you don't see any legitimacy in the other camp. And I think this is wrong and deeply unhelpful for trying to make progress. It's very difficult talking to people who deny that anything happened on the 7th of October or said Israel directly organized what happened on the 7th of October. These are absurdities. So, we've still got to keep that factual basis in mind. Okay, this was not the first problem. This was not the first incident. But there's something very important happened, something horrible happened on the 7th of October. To me now, all these months later, what has happened since is every bit as important as what happened on the 7th of October. The deaths, the civilian deaths, since then are a huge problem. I am a supporter, indeed an admirer of what the United States has been doing. The United States has been trying to move things forward. I mean, they ventriloquized last week a proposal which was clearly an American peace proposal. They said it was an Israeli proposal, tried to sort of move things forward, but Israel did not respond as hoped. Now, talking as a private person, not as an official, it feels to me as though Israel very much needs a new government. That Mr. Netanyahu is not open to any element which I think is part of solving this problem. He has explicitly rejected the idea of a Palestinian state. In the past, he was sort of equivocal, but now he is adamantine. With that mindset, with that policy approach, I don't see how he is going to help. It's very difficult advising the people of another country about their leadership. But again, the debate starting elsewhere, hoping to provoke something within Israel for Israelis to see that perhaps this is a moment to change their government.
I want to open up soon for audience questions. A couple of final ones from me. I'm quoting directly from the book. I'm quoting slightly out of context, but it is a direct quote. You write, "Respect for human rights defines the UK. But we also last night heard the Prime Minister talk about openly advocate leaving international human rights treaties. So what happened to the consensus on human rights?"
It has been my personal promise not to appear in the media during the election campaign. But I think this is a private event, so nobody's live tweeting. But I think what the Prime Minister said yesterday was wrong. I think it misunderstands and even betrays Britain's fundamentals. Human rights does define the United Kingdom. It is relevant that British lawyers helped to draft all the key treaties. The European Court of Human Rights is something which is a British achievement. The idea that we would walk away from that for a short-term benefit to a failing policy, I think is wrong. I can't be clearer than that.
And finally, we open up. I said at the start there was a distinguished tradition of books by diplomats, and one of them is actually a book by your father-in-law, who wrote a famously candid memoir of his career. So I was just wondering if your father-in-law actually the dedicatee of your first book. So I was wondering if that book was an inspiration of any kind to you.
Well, yes, but I'm sounding a bit hesitant, and I'm aware that my mother-in-law is within 100 yards of where we're meeting. It was too candid in a way, because my father-in-law kept a diary, and it was very important for him as sort of a lightning rod, as a sort of a safety cord. He put everything down in writing at the end of the day that he'd not been able to say during the day. And 20 years after he retired, he returned to these diaries, and he thought, well, this is all quite interesting. And of course it was quite interesting, but some of that personal, immediate reaction maybe is best kept private. And so I urged him, as he was writing that book, to sort of throttle back a bit. You've read the book, so you know exactly how successful I was in that effort.
Okay, so I think we'll open up to questions from the audience. Please do introduce yourself before you ask your question. Yep, right there in the back.
He is a modern Pliny the Elder, in the sense that he has covered all the wars of the world. So now may I leave it to both of you to take the floor. Thank you very much indeed.
Yes, first of all, thank you, Master. That was lovely. In fact, we were talking about India yesterday. Now for something remarkable, actually. I've read biographies, I've read a lot of memoirs, but I haven't read one like this one, this A Flat Place, Noreen Masood's memoir. It's a bit geography. She writes about places in Lahore where she had her childhood. And then geography is interesting, where she goes to places near here, the Fenlands, which I know. I never realized that it was one marshlands. I know this area very well because my in-laws are not very far from here, actually, in Histon. But that's not the most interesting part of the book. It's the way that you've woven in your personal story into the book. And as I was reading the book, it's almost like a thriller, where you don't tell your story, who you are, your family. It's revealed bit by bit by bit by bit, like Salman Rushdie's, the finding out about someone through the holes of a chador.
That's a lovely compliment. To be like a thriller, that's all I've ever wanted. I mean it, it's great.
I wanted to know, what is a thriller? You want to know what happens next.
Sure.
I made some notes, actually, at lunchtime, because she doesn't say who her sisters are. One sister is Forget-Me-Not. Another one, the twins are Rabbit and Spot. So instead of asking Noreen to say what the book is about, I think I can pretty well sum it up in the blurb here, which would save a lot of time because I would like to leave more time for questions. So it just says very quickly that Noreen Masood has always loved flatlands. Her earliest memories of a wide, flat field glimpsed from the backseat of her father's car in Lahore. As an adult in Britain, she has discovered many more flat landscapes to love. Orford Ness, the Cambridgeshire Fens, for that. Morecambe Bay, Orkney, these bare, haunted expanses remind her of the flat place inside herself, the place created by trauma. So when I was reading the book, I felt very protective about the author, funnily. Noreen suffers from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and she has been very frank in describing, how she felt at certain times in her book. The product of a profoundly disrupted and unstable childhood. It flattens her emotions, blanks out parts of her memory, and colors her world with anxiety. Seeking solace in the landscape she loves, in a flat place, she strikes out on a series of walks through Britain's flatlands, weaving her impressions of the natural world with poetry, folklore and history, and with recollections of her early life. Her British-Pakistani heritage makes Noreen a partial outsider in these landscapes, both colonizer and colonized, inheritor and dispossessed. Here, violence lies beneath the fantasy of pastoral innocence, and legacies of harm are interwoven with nature's power to heal. Here, as in her own family history, are many stories that resist the telling. Noreen Masood pursues these paradoxes fearlessly across the flat spaces she loves, rendering a startlingly strange, vivid, and intimate account of the land beneath her feet. So you see what I mean, that she weaves in her personal story and her fragility into the geography. Let me begin by saying that when you write a memoir, when people write their memoir, it's very difficult because you have to have a balance between being honest and not wanting to hurt family members, yes, revealing too much. But you have been frank to a degree I found quite astonishing.
Astonishing is an interesting word. I never know whether it's a compliment or something else.
At times, I was quite shocked.
Yes. I felt a dual responsibility writing this book, because this is the story of an upbringing in Lahore that is unusual even for Lahore. It's unusual compared to many lives in this country, but it was unusual even there. Writing this story, and I've been trying to write a version of this story since I was 14 years old, and some of the things in it were actually happening to me. Language has always been, as it is for many writers, how I make sense of the world around me. And I felt if I can get this into words, it will be real and I will know I'm not going mad. And I have returned to the story again and again, and was eventually able to write, to find a form for it, through the flatland, the image of the flatland, at the age of about 32. But I felt, and you're right, I felt the question of what I owed, or the responsibility I had to the family, was a big one. But there was a further responsibility that I felt. I was aware that I was publishing this book in a British publishing landscape, and I was very aware of the kinds of books that British publishers like to publish about women of colour's lives. They love stories about how we grew up in terrible circumstances in South Asian families, and then we come to Britain and everything's fine. And I didn't want to write that story, and I didn't want to have that story weaponised against people of colour. So it was a very, very difficult line to tread, to be honest about what had happened to me, and yet at the same time keep my focus on the fact that the complex post-traumatic stress disorder I've sustained in my life is not because of what my family did to me, well, partly that, but partly that there is no sane way of living as a woman of colour in a post-colonial world. It always is an insane experience to be a woman. It is an impossibly insane experience to be a woman of colour in this world. And, yeah. So, how to keep my focus and my anger where it needed to be was a big question.
Now, you write about Lahore, which Rahul's dad loved. I've been to Lahore. It's amazingly beautiful place, and it's got an amazing bookshop. In fact, I wandered into a book.
What are you thinking of? It might have been after I left.
Awesome.
When I was growing up, there weren't so many good bookshops there. Which one are you thinking of?
Well, it had Urdu books.
Sure.
But it had 2 English books. And I wandered in there, and it had a book which said Muslim students who had been at Cambridge. And I thought, no, I won't buy that. And I wandered down, and I said, you will never get the chance of buying that book again. So I went back and I bought it. But Lahore, when you describe it, that your dad had 1 room, bedroom, and your mum and the 4 girls, another bedroom. You talk about the chicken wire, that you go to school in the car, you come back, you're not allowed to mix. But Lahore seemed more like a prison, and not at all like the Lahore of my imagination.
That was my Lahore. And I hope I'm quite careful in the book to say that this is an unusual experience of Lahore. It's not everybody's. Having said that, the number of Lahori women who've written to me and said, because I think it's very different being a woman and being a man in Lahore. I think it's 2 separate worlds. It's 2 different lives. I can't speak for every woman. I'm sure there are so many women who've had a very different experience than I have. For me, my world was 2 rooms and school. That was it.
And you weren't allowed to mix with other people?
No, I wasn't allowed to speak to neighbours. I wasn't allowed, and this is where it becomes unusual. I wasn't, in my family, I wasn't allowed to mix with cousins. I was discouraged from mingling with the wider family. We lived an extraordinarily isolated life, even for a Pakistani woman.
And here we come to, on your way to school, you look out of the car, you're at the back of the car with your sisters, and you always wait for that point where you see the flatlands, which are empty, and you contrast that with a city that is bustling and Lahore is very busy. So that's where, in a sense, the geography begins. So can you recall why that was important, the flatlands?
Sure. So this is one of my strongest memories from my childhood, and I've tried so many times to find these on a map, and I've failed. My memory, we were so imprisoned in my life that I can't map any of my experiences onto the maps that I now have available to me of Lahore with any success. But I remember very keenly a moment on my way to school where suddenly there were huge empty fields. And in my mind they were huge. In my memory, I was a little child then, so I'm sure they weren't that big, but to me they were huge. And that was one thing. And they were always green. Now, that was pretty much the only time I saw in Lahore a space that was green, because, it's so rare to have grass that survives the rigours of the weather, unless it's intensively irrigated. These fields are always green in my memory. And the contrast between that and the cramped situation I inhabited at home, and the cramped intellectual and interpersonal freedom I was allowed, was huge. So there was a sense of space in those fields that meant a lot to me, but there was something bigger. A flatland is a space in which nothing is hidden. There is no space for any lies, any concealments, any dissembling. So a flatland came to stand for me for a kind of absolute honesty. And where I grew up, in the context I grew up, the family I grew up in, there were a lot of lies. There was a lot of what we might call gaslighting now. And it's left me with an absolute horror of not telling the truth. So the flatland seemed an emblem of complete, proud openness.
There's a line here where you say that flat landscapes have always given me a way to love myself. And then a few paragraphs down you say, I didn't think much about those fields again for years until I took up a place on a master's course in Cambridge. So since we are in Cambridge, can you connect the two things?
For sure. I was always a very intense child. I knew what I knew to be true. That was not always easy for the people around me to accommodate, when the circumstances required that they pretend something else was the case. There is something for me about a flat landscape, a perfectly flat landscape, like the fenland landscapes around us, where you have this, and it's unusual because we're taught that mountains are more valuable, mountains are more beautiful. It doesn't count as a landscape unless there's rises and falls, things to look at, a forest, a river. So when I talk about a flat landscape, it's something that almost isn't a landscape at all. A space in which there isn't anything worth looking at. But for me, a flat landscape is perfectly beautiful. There is something defiant and unapologetic about the way that horizon line cuts itself across the sky. I can look at it endlessly. And they have always, we tell ourselves stories about the things we love, and the story I tell myself about flat landscapes is that their unapologeticness told me that I wasn't mad, and that what I knew to be true was true. And it's funny, I think, how these really basic symbols, as sort of Jungian archetypes, how they shape our worlds in a really fundamental way, in a way that we don't need to think about them that much, right? Because they're just always there. Flat landscapes, I talk in the book, they are the base that my life stands upon. They're the kind of fundamental image that gives the rest of my life meaning and shape. But yeah, for that reason I didn't think about it very much until I arrived in Cambridge, and I was being driven from Ely to Cambridge, and I shot up in my seat because I was faced with a landscape that I hadn't thought about in years. And I was seeing those landscapes along the road. I was back in Lahore. There's something interesting about a flat landscape in that one's brain is always trying to find something to focus on in a flat landscape. And in the absence of that focal point, memories come in. And different landscapes from different times in one's life collide and combine. And I was back in Lahore in that moment. That was one thing that the Cambridgeshire Fens gave me. Access back to a place that I can never return to, because I can't go back to Pakistan.
Yes, I began by saying that the geography is a sort of metaphor for what is internal, and you spell it out here. From Pakistan to flat landscapes stay with me, one outside our house, one inside it. So you've then looked for yourself in a number of other landscapes. You just mentioned a couple of them.
For sure.
And one you went with your mum.
Yes. So I'm British Pakistani, my father's Pakistani and my mother is British, and my father is now dead, but he disowned me when I was 16, which is the point at which I came with my sisters and my mother to the UK. So obviously a very complicated relationship with him, but also had and continue to have quite a complicated relationship with my mother. So when I was writing this book, I had a sort of things in my life reached a sort of point of crisis in about 2019, and after that I started visiting flat landscapes around the UK to try to find a way of giving my strange life form in a book. And I went to the Cambridgeshire Fens, that's one of the first walks I went on, Orford Ness in Suffolk, in the sort of south of the country, then Morecambe Bay in the northwest of the country. The pandemic hit and I spent a long time I was living in Newcastle at the time, in the northeast, and I spent a lot of time returning to Newcastle Moor, an amazing flat landscape in the centre of the city. And then the final landscape, the one I went to with my mother, was Orkney. My mother lives in Scotland now, and that's an extraordinary flat landscape. And that was a space in which something was able to happen between us in our relationship. There was nothing else there to distract us. We were faced with one another in a new way. Yeah.
There's an intriguing line here. I loved some people, but I still couldn't bear to be near them.
Yeah. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder is different in several important ways from what we might call ordinary post-traumatic stress disorder. So I'm going to show you something. Post-traumatic stress disorder, we have a sort of shape for it in our minds. Things are normal, and then something terrible happens, and after that nothing is the same again. And you can see what I've done with my finger here. I've described or traced out a mountain, you know? And when you look back at your life, there is a focal point that you can identify as the point where things changed, and after which nothing was the same again. Complex PTSD is very different in that there is no single event, no mountain, if you like, in the landscape that you can point to as the problem. In complex post-traumatic stress disorder, there are countless events that happen, and you can't point to one and say that's the reason. Other things that identify CPTSD, the events happened before you were old enough to understand what an event was, and you had very little hope of escape, or any hope that things would change. And one of the things that leaves you with is a real despair about the capacity of people to hear you or connect with you. So relationships and the question of how we relate to other people and how we love other people and how we do the right thing by other people, that is the biggest and most urgent question of my life.
I was trying to understand why your dad felt betrayed. At one point you say that my dad disowned me, and I tried to understand why.
Yeah.
And it seemed that you were ambitious to do O-levels and A-levels in England. You applied, and I still haven't quite worked it out.
Yeah, so it comes back to what you said early on, and in the book I say this is the point where I come to the bit I can't tell you. This is the hole in the story that I can't share. the centre of the book, the reason why my father disowned me and we came to the UK, is not my story to tell. It involves somebody else who would be very vulnerable if I were to share more details. This was one of the reasons why it took me so long to write this book, because I thought, how can I tell this story without this event in the centre? Which is why the flat landscape gave me a shape to use. In the end, I was just very honest, I think, in the book, saying I can't tell you why. So you're going to have to live with the experience that I live with. In other words, the experience of CPTSD. Complex PTSD means you live alongside things that you will never know completely. There are so many holes in my memory. There are so many memories I have that I know cannot be true. I have to live alongside that uncertainty and I have to tolerate it. In this case, so does the reader. And it is uncomfortable. And people have complained to me about it. And I say, well, now you know what it's like. And the other good thing that that does, not being able to tell the story, is when people hear about my life, they think that being disowned was the bad thing. They think that was the mountain of trauma in my life that they can point to and say that was the bad thing. Being disowned was the best thing that ever happened to me. It was the 16 years before that that was the trauma. The flat landscape, where I can't point out one particular incident that was the problem, but that I cannot stop looking at. That flat landscape is what I want my reader to keep the eye on, not the irrelevant mountain of having been disowned.
Yes. You know, I've read several lines again and again, and as I said, this is a memoir like any other. Very few memoirs I've read where a young woman writes, when I was 15, my father disowned me. That was what I was referring to. And then the couple of pages here that, what's the word? I mean, I better be honest. I was, can't find the word, maybe shocked. But when you get a text from your sister saying that your dad has died.
Yeah, in 2019.
Yes. So I don't know how much you can say about the complexity about the relationship with your dad.
Sure. Is there a? Would you like me to talk about my response to his death or
Yes,
something else?
yes.
Yeah. I felt. I mean, this is a very common thing when you have a complex relationship with someone who's just died. I felt extremely angry with him, and I hadn't anticipated. It was a very sudden death. It was very, very sudden. He was at work in the morning, and then he was found dead in the afternoon. No one had anticipated it, certainly not me. I felt very angry with him because I realised deep down that I had. He had always hated me. Like, it was not indifference to me. He had always really actively hated me. In a way, I don't think he hated my other sisters, which is interesting to me, and I have various theories about it. But I had wanted to button a hole in it at some point in my life and say, you see, I've done it. I've succeeded. And you tried to stop me. And now I realise, and then it was all taken out of my sails, because now I never could, because he was dead. And he had got one over on me again. That's what it felt like. So I felt furious.
But not just that. I mean, you ring up pathologists and so on.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Gosh. So, I became really preoccupied. I didn't think about him in my day-to-day life much before that. There were several incidents after he disowned me where I became aware in various ways that he was surveilling me, he was hacking into my inbox, my email inbox, things like that. So I was slightly aware of him in my life, and I had an anxiety about him sort of over my shoulder. But then when he died, I was suddenly newly aware of him as an object on the earth in the way that he hadn't been to me when he was alive. Suddenly he was a physical object in a way he hadn't been to me since I was very young, and I was physically frightened of him. Suddenly he was solid again. And I couldn't get this out of my head, and I wanted him to be gone. I wanted him to be completely gone. I wanted his body to have decayed. And so, yeah, I I went and I researched how long it would take, and I'm just being dead honest about my reactions. I'm not trying to apologise to them or say they were the right thing. I became preoccupied with wanting him off the earth and out of my world. And I emailed pathologists, say, how long does it take for a corpse to decay in the ground? And they said, well, it will depend on all kinds of things. We can't give you an answer. And so it was several years before I could be at rest.
If you fast forward to your life in this country, you talk sometimes about the reaction of other people to yourself. And there's some funny lines in here. Someone says, oh, you grew up in Pakistan. Wow, I wouldn't have guessed. You sound, so English.
Yeah.
You could be on the BBC. So what was Pakistan like? Now, in multicultural Britain, there are lots of people who are children of mixed parents, you know, English father, Indian mother, Pakistani father, so on. Have you reached, what is the word, healing? You know, that's the theme. Have you healed yourself?
No. I don't think it's possible. This is where we come on to something bigger. I do not think it is possible. Okay, so therapeutic practice says this. Therapeutic practice says if you have post-traumatic stress disorder, it's a disorder in your mind where you weren't safe in the past, but now you are safe. Now the world is safe, so you can relax and you can connect with it again. So you can see that that healing is predicated on the world now being safe. But the world is not safe. The world is not safe for people of colour. The world is not safe for women of colour. What I see in Gaza every day shows me that the world is not safe for people racialised, particularly people racialised as Muslim. I would have to delude myself to tell myself that this is a safe world. So I am not healed. And to heal, I would have to become stupid. To heal, I would have to shut my eyes and my ears to what is happening around me. So no, I'm not healed, and I think that I am proud not to embrace a deliberate blindness. If that's what's required to be healed, then I won't heal.
I would like to open it up to questions.
Yeah, Noreen, I'd like to, you mentioned about your relationship with your father. I'd like to know something about your relationship with your mother and your sisters.
Yes.
And your sisters.
Yeah.
And you also said that you will never go back to Pakistan.
Yeah.
But over the years, Pakistan might have changed.
Oh, so I would love to go back to Pakistan, to be clear. I would love to. The reason I can't go back to Pakistan is my Pakistani passport is now expired. To renew it, I would need a signature from either my father, who is dead, my husband, who I will never have, and a gay woman. The other thing I would have to do as someone registered Muslim in my passport is sign, essentially, an act of state-sponsored hate against the Ahmadi Muslims, which I'm not willing to do. If you're registered as Muslim in Pakistan, as many people will know, you have to say, essentially, I don't think the Ahmadis are real Muslims. And as part of like Pakistan's...
I don't think what?
I don't, so basically it's the exact wording of the statement I don't have access to, but essentially it's that I believe there were no prophets after Muhammad, and I don't think the Ahmadi prophet is a real one. And Pakistan's campaign of hate against the Ahmadis is so all-encompassing, so vast and so vicious, I don't want any part of it. So I will never be able to renew my Pakistani passport. And there would be, I think, some complications if I went back on my British one, from experiences that my siblings have had. Really good question about my relationship with my mother and my sisters. I'm in touch with my mother. We have a complicated relationship. I don't understand quite simply why she didn't get us out of there. But we have started to make connections in a way that's good. And one of the big catalysts for that actually was writing this book. In writing this book, I was able to say things in a way that she could hear, finally, in a way that couldn't be kind of dismissed or ignored. And I think we're now closer than we have been since I was a small child. My relationship with my sisters is very difficult. They say that every child in a family that doesn't work grows up in a different family. And in some way, I have been unimaginably lucky in my life. Unimaginably. I came to this country at a time when I could benefit from 2 years of comprehensive school in Scotland. I was able to choose what I wanted to study at university. I was able to go to a good university where I was very well looked after. I was given scholarships to fund my education. None of my sisters had access to this. I talk in the book about my younger sister, whose epileptic fits were ignored until she was 18 years old, by which time it was too late to do anything about them. She'd missed her education. Of course, she feels rage and bitterness. Who wouldn't? And so, yeah, there's a lot of pain between all of us. Again, even just in the last month, you know, these connections start to be repaired a little bit, but it's slow work. It's slow work. I hope that answers your question.
Can I ask one last question? Master.
I apologise, but I'm fascinated. You said your father hated you, but didn't hate your sisters. Would your sisters agree with that assessment?
Oh, a great question. I think that the ones who were particularly loved know they were particularly loved. Another sister feels she was not liked. Yeah. So my father really loved my younger sister and my second sister. There were 4 of us because she looked like him. And that was known. That was a known phenomenon. There were no boys. You see, that was a problem in our family. Again, this is not true of all Pakistani families. I can only speak for my own. And one thing I want to make very clear at this point: this is not a book about how being in a Pakistani family is bad. It's not a book about how being in a Muslim family is bad. The reason my family was the way it was is because my father was an Anglophile. My father kept us, and I'll explain what I mean. My father was an Anglophile who was really contemptuous of Pakistani society, really contemptuous of the religious context around him. He wanted to keep us away from that, which is why he wouldn't allow us to speak to neighbours, wouldn't allow us to speak to cousins or friends. And this is part of the long tail of colonialism. Pakistan lives in a constant state of trauma, of post-colonial trauma, where its reality has not been affirmed. Where it's still, when I was a child growing up in Pakistan, our textbooks were all about how it snows in the winter and the leaves change colour in autumn, because these are the books imported from Britain. And we looked outside and there was no snow. And there were just brown leaves on the trees all year round. There is a sense that what is around you in a post-colonial country is not real. And only the things that happen to white people are real. Only the things in those books are real. It is very difficult to recover from that. And I see there's marks of that on my father and in his choices about how to raise us.
Thank you, Noreen. Ladies and gentlemen, the book is quite something. Thank you, Noreen.
Thank you very much indeed, Noreen Masood, and Ahmed, for your cross-examination. Giving you a frank assessment, candid assessment of his experience as a diplomat, and now you've heard a very personal and deeply moving admission, if you like, self-analysis by Noreen. As a fellow Lahori, let me just apologize on behalf of 12 million Lahoris for everything that you had to go through, and also to say to you, you're more than welcome to come back, and there are no declarations involved. They are against it, as you say, but we all have to succumb to them. But please, you're more than welcome. Noreen, when you talked about flatlands, you sort of reminded me of that you must be the architect's nightmare, because all you see are flatlands and nothing protruding. But I understand the difficulty that you must have gone through with PTSD and how you've coped with it, and the courage that you've demonstrated by reducing it to a book. When I say reducing, being able to compress it, compress your thoughts in a book. I'm reminded, and please don't misunderstand this, because my son is going to be publishing a book which I'm told is going to be a revelation about us as his parents. So I'm reminded of a cartoon which showed a lady signing books at a book launch, and an elderly couple comes to her and says, "Darling, if we had known that you'd be writing about us, we would have treated you much better." So, on that, let me thank both of you, Shirin and Amit, for a very entertaining, very moving disclosure and self-analysis that you've been able to provide. There's going to be tea and then a session immediately afterwards, so may I ask you to scorch your palates and your throats. Quick cup of tea, coffee, as the case may be, and then join us back here for the third session, which is going to be at 4:40. Many thanks indeed. But before you go, just a word of acknowledgement. Apart from the usual ones, we have here a distinguished diplomat, Sir Nicholas Barrington. He was the High Commissioner in Pakistan, and probably the most successful High Commissioners we've had, because he was there for 7 years. And he has the unique distinction of preparing the Almanac de Gotha of all the families, notable families in Pakistan, which he carries in his head. And the other distinction he had was that he saw Princess Di swim in his swimming pool. Thank you.
It's the person next to her.
All right.
Yeah. They just put together. Just take a picture of him with their
Pose for a photo, I'll pick it up.
They want to take pictures of you.
Okay, young man, let's take a picture. Sorry, excuse me, sir. Excuse me. Sorry.
Sorry. You should be proud to be It's got drawings. That's the excuse for it.
Thank you very much.
You want a cup of tea or coffee?
Without sugar.
And milk?
Yes, it's possible that.
Is the tea bags
Larry, you've had your test and you're all right.
4 sugars, yes, 4 sugars.
She's not with me, she's not.
this one. Very good. I need a spoon.
Ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. Right to the back? Good. You know, when we were at school, I was studying chartered accountancy, and boys were scattered rather like this, and they were sitting at the back, and I remember the lecturer at the time saying, "You lot, in front." Nothing from there. So my advice to you is, come in front. Of course, they're from the Cambridge Union, I understand. Yes?
Can I tell you what the cat happened to me once? Some Frank said, "Can you hear me?" And he said, "Well, I can hear you perfectly well, and I'm happy to change places with someone who can't." Good.
Good. Well, we've had two very interesting sessions earlier today, and now, for the final session, we've got Mihir Bose, who has been here for the past 60 years, and his book, "Thank You, Mr. Crombie, Lessons in Guilt and Gratitude to the British." So it's an ambivalent relationship that we have with the British, but it's one that I think both parties should be proud of. You'll see his CV here. I won't repeat it. You can read faster than I can speak. He's been formerly the BBC sports editor, and he's written for major UK newspapers and authored 26 books on topics including Bollywood, football, cricket, and the only thing that's missing here is politics. Yeah? But we've got Bollywood and football, why not politics as well? But his book is available and strongly recommended. He'll be interviewed by Nigel Dudley. Nigel Dudley has been, as he describes, a random hack who's been traveling throughout the world for the past 4 to 5 years. He's decided to stop over in Cambridge and interview Mihir. So, can I leave it to you, Mr. Dudley? Microphone. Sorry.
Good afternoon. It's a privilege to interview me here. He and I have been friends for alarmingly 45 years. We've been together through the good times, the bad times, and he's written the most brilliant book which combines the personal perspective on life with which he builds inexorably into his view of global politics. Mihir is an ultimate man of all sorts in that he was trained as an accountant, he's acted on the stage, he's written plays, he's written about politics, and as you heard, about Bollywood and almost everything. And at the end of the book he writes some most wonderful essays which bring all his subjects together. I'd like to start by asking you, Mihir, about a quote from Gandhi, who when asked said, "What do you think of Western civilization?" He responded, "I think it would be a good idea." Do you share his view?
Yes, I think it would be a good idea. Gandhi got at least that right. I am a Bengali, so I grew up in an anti-Gandhi atmosphere when I qualified straight away, though I think he was a great man. First of all, Nigel, thank you for doing what in India is called maska lagawing, buttering up. I don't know if you hear the expression, but that's a wonderful expression. I think the problem with Western civilization is that the West doesn't know what a civilization is. I mean, when Gandhi was talking of Western civilization, it was meant to be European civilization and European-based civilization. And then after the Second World War, the word West got transformed into Western Europe, not under the control of the Soviets, America, Canada, Australia, and so on. And I think Western civilization is actually going through a bit of a crisis now, as shown in the problem with immigration, these people coming from other parts of the world and so on, and how the West is basically, Europe historically has been a continent that exports people, not imports people, and suddenly it's importing people and not having lost a war. When you lose a war, you have to pay compensation, but Europe is doing that, and I think that is causing a great crisis all round in the West.
Yes, we were talking earlier about one of what I think is a fascinating thing, which is that when Poland in the middle of the 19th century was going through a particular trauma, a whole group of 200 Poles ended up in Turkey, and the Turkish response, a Muslim country dealing with Catholics, was to give them a home, a village just inside Asia called Polonezhku, which it was allowed to operate a full a culture of what they had at home. And I suspect that Western Europe you don't see Western Europe as being quite as welcoming, or indeed not welcoming at all, to people who come from strange, faraway places. There's not an immediate say, come and be at home with us.
No, because I think, because Europe has expanded into other parts of the world, and the other parts of the world know Europe, but Europe doesn't know the other parts of the world. I mean, the great Nigerian journalist said Nigeria's history has been transported into other people's history, but therefore the Nigerian has to know other history, and the other Europeans don't have to know Nigerian history. And I'll give you a small example of that. One of the great kings of India, of the Gupta dynasty, and the Gupta dynasty is a very famous dynasty in India, is Samudragupta. And I went to school in India, and we were told, and this would be 6th century AD, the Guptas, and it's quite an interesting story that India, having become Buddhist, became Hindu again. A different story. Samudragupta was a great king, united India and so on, and Samudragupta was introduced to us as the Napoleon of India. Now, he predated Napoleon by nearly 1,000 years, more than that. And, if you like, if in this country you were to say to somebody, Napoleon is the Samudragupta of Europe, that would be considered roguery. That would be considered outrageous. But we were supposed to know both Napoleon and Samudragupta. But people here will only know Napoleon. And I think the Europeans don't sometimes understand the impact that their ancestors made on the world. And, the fact that they remade the world, and that world is the world we have inherited.
But you see that as a myth? Is the view of Europe and what Europe did in terms of influencing the world, is it myth or reality?
Well, no, Europe did influence the world, and the world...
What is the idea, the view that you have of Europe? Is that the way you saw it when you were growing up in Calcutta and Mumbai? Was that a myth? Did you discover that to be a myth, or was it a reality?
Well, parts of it were a myth, because I had this sort of imagined England that I grew up in. My generation of Indians were very proud to call ourselves the first free generation of Indians after 200 years of British rule. So nowadays, unfortunately, the Hindutva movement would say that they should be talking of the first free generation after 1,000 years, because they consider the Muslims to be interlopers and outsiders and so on, which I don't agree with. And we were very proud of that. But at the same time, we wanted European British validation in particular. We in our newspapers, we read articles from various English newspapers like The Economist, The Times, The Guardian, and so on. And to give you another example from India and Mumbai, where I grew up, we have in the centre of Mumbai a park called Shivaji Park, which has produced some of the greatest of Indian cricketers. And the sports editor of the Times of India described Shivaji Park as the Pudsey of Bombay. Pudsey is the birthplace of Len Hutton. So by saying it was the birthplace, it was the Pudsey of Bombay, we felt validated. So if you go to Pudsey and say Pudsey is the Shivaji Park of Yorkshire, it would be considered workery. Actually, Shivaji Park has produced a cricket team. Pudsey has only produced one cricketer, admittedly a great cricketer. But you know, that is the sort of thing that we look for. But what I didn't realise when I came to this country in '69, 7 months after Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, is that I would be set aside because of the colour of my skin. That is not something I was prepared for. I realised that I was different, but I didn't realise that I would be set aside because of what my skin colour was. Fortunately, when I started working for the Sunday Times copy takers, and in those days you telephoned copy to the copy takers, solved my name problem. I didn't have to become Malcolm or Michael, because the first time I was giving copy to the Sunday Times copy takers, this was from Stamford Bridge, this is a football match report. I rang up and I said, here, I'm Mihir Bose from Stamford Bridge, and the copy taker said, we know you're there, Mihir, but what is your name? You know, so after that I've always introduced myself as Mihir, I'm here, you see, so therefore I haven't changed my name in that sense. But you know, but there were moments when I came here, I mean, it was very interesting. 6 weeks after coming here, I was elected president of Loughborough University Students' Union. Probably they couldn't find anybody. That day it snowed, our previous speaker, it snowed. I'd never seen snow. I thought, you know, the wastepaper basket in heaven had been tipped over. And I got elected, and this student, a woman, said I voted for him because he had a trustworthy face. You see, I have been told after I started working for radio that I have the face for radio. But you know, but the point is that, but at the same time, and this is within weeks of being elected president, I had to represent Loughborough somewhere, and I went there, and after I'd spoken, this lady, formidable-looking lady, came up to me and said, "Young man, you've spoken very well. I can see you've been educated well in this country. I hope you'll go back to India. It's a poor country, and it needs people like you. We have too many people here." So, you know, early on, I was aware that immigration was an issue. But when I went to London, I suddenly realized that I was finding it difficult to find bed sits in London because, you know, of the colour of my skin. One of them actually said, we wouldn't like to have an Indian. And the thing about bed sits was, I will tell you a story of my growing up. When I was growing up, we had an elderly uncle. He was called uncle. In India, you can form instant families. You know, every guest of the parent becomes an uncle and aunt and so on. But anyway, this was a genuine relation, and he used to be called half pant by one of my aunts. A half pant is what shorts in India are called, and that's what servants wear. You know, if you wear half pant, you're considered rather poor. Once my sister came here, and I was wearing shorts in summer, and she quietly came up to me and said, "Mihir, are you all right? You need some money." But anyway, and this guy, half pant, he had lived here during the Blitz. He was very proud of surviving the Blitz and proud of how the British had behaved. And he used to carry in his pocket a napkin, a knife and a fork, because he thought the way Indians ate with their hands was very dirty. He would bring out the knife and the fork when he was given food at our place, which he always wore. And he said, "Now listen, young man," he said, "you're going to go to England to study. And you know, when you go there, you will rent a bedsit. It'll be a grumpy woman who will rent it. She's nothing to look at. But the moment you open the bedsit and open the closet, out will jump a nubile young English woman, and she will trap you. Now, I warn you, do not fall into her trap, because she is working class, no more important than that maid would be sweeping, than the Rani there, you see. Have good fun with her, but don't bring her back. If you're going to marry a daughter of an earl or a knight or something like that, you see. So, but what happened was, every time I got a bedsit eventually, I would open the closet and nobody jumped out, you see. So,
that's why you stay in so many hotels now. You go to the first. No, if you'll excuse me for 1 second, I will drag you back to the copy taker's story. It is just probably an apocryphal story, but it is always told of the foreign correspondent who is 50 years ago was in the middle of some place where he found it very difficult to get a telephone line into the office, rang up the Daily Telegraph, got through to the switchboard and said, "Hello, it's Fred Smith here. And they say, who? Fred? Oh, sorry, Fred Smith he's away, he's travelling overseas. Could you ring in a week's time? Put the phone down. so these copy takers are a law unto themselves. But if I can just bring you back to actually the question of, you've seen some of the worst behaviour in this country. Particularly when you were reporting on sports matches, mainly football, I guess. And did that leave a lasting hurt on you, a lasting memory? How do you feel about those people who were so rude, abusive and physically aggressive towards you at that time?
Well, I was frightened. I remember in 1980 I was travelling on a Piccadilly line tube, hanging on by the straps in a very crowded compartment, and a skinhead walked by and, punched me on the cheek, and my glasses went flying and nobody said anything. And afterwards, returning from football matches, I was chased by football fans and things like that. What disturbed me was, in one of those trips, I really thought I wouldn't be able to survive, but it was a young boy who first of all asked me what my name was, and when I told my name, he said, "Why aren't you called Patel? All you Pakis are called Patels." And then he said, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm a journalist." He said, "What do you write for?" I said, "The Sunday Times," and that stumped him, because I don't think he'd heard of the Sunday Times. And then he asked me, and this would be 1981, he would have been about 10, he said, "What do you think of Enoch Powell?" And I said, "I understand he's a very good Greek scholar," and I think that stumped him a bit more as well, because he wasn't sure what that was supposed to mean. I think that the fact that in 1981 a 10-year-old was asking questions of Enoch Powell and all that sort of thing made me worried about the impact of all that had happened in the immediate post-war world on the young people. But then I also had lots of opportunities in this country. Doors opened, people gave me opportunities. I must confess, I bluffed my way into journalism. London Broadcasting had just started. I told them I know all about cricket, and they employed me. But the contrast is with All India Radio. When I asked the head of All India Radio whether I could do some broadcast, head of All India Radio Sport, he said, could I get some perfumes for his wife from Harrods? You see, nobody in this country has ever asked me for perfumes from Harrods or anywhere before they've employed me. You see, so in India, doors opened because of family connection. The only job I got in India was through sheer nepotism. My brother-in-law was a senior partner of an accountancy firm. I was a chartered accountant, so I got employed. In this country, doors opened and people did see you. There is in India a word called chamcha, which means spoon, but actually what it means is a sycophant, you see. And when people become very important, they all have chamchas around them. So in order to get to them, you have to go through the chamchas. In this country, the phenomenon of chamchas hasn't come about. People will answer the phone, will talk to you, so there is in this country a duality between the hard reality, the harsh face of this country that I have witnessed, but also a much mellower kind of face, which has changed in the nearly 60 years that I've been here.
But I came across what happens in India when I was reporting on a cricket match between India and Pakistan in Indore, and I desperately needed to get to Mumbai to catch my flight back to the UK. And the local cricket association said, absolutely no trouble, we'll get you on the flight from Indore to Mumbai so you can catch your flight, but even though there was no space on it at all. So duly we arrived at the airport, and I was my host took my ticket and came back with a boarding pass, and I was duly, deeply grateful, etc., etc. And he said to me, "We don't mind doing this is our honour to do this. What we don't understand is that when we have a similar problem at Heathrow, no one sorts it out for us."
Oh, wow, that's fairness, isn't it? But I think we had a very different image of England particularly, and what England was like when I was growing up, and I think that image of England has changed, and it's very interesting, and this is an interesting reflection on immigration. Most of my school generation actually migrated, didn't come here. My father's generation came here to study. They went to America. Most of them went to America. Most of them actually are settled, in Silicon Valley and places like that. And as it happened, most of them are Trump supporters, but that's a different story. I'm one of the few who came here, and when I left India to come here, the foreign exchange situation was so bad that you only got £2, and the joke in India was that was just enough to pay for your shot of whiskey to survive the Air India flight. Actually, you needed more. You needed more than one glass of whiskey to survive the Air India flight. But and I had to smuggle £800 in a specially made underwear to pay for my first year at university. So I actually violated, if you like, Indian customs law. I better not broadcast it because the Modi government might bring charges against me. But,
do you still have the underpants?
I tell you what I have. I have the dinner jacket, which was made by Dean's near Regal Cinema, who said, I've always made dinner jackets for all the sizes, and everybody in England dresses for dinner. I still have that dinner jacket. The only person I found when I came to this country dressed in a dinner jacket was Indian waiters in Indian restaurants. Apart from that, I didn't find too many people dressed in a dinner jacket having a meal.
You were not even at the Reform Club. Now, I'd like to bring you on to, I think, an area which, or an episode, which I think perhaps sums up many of the problems that we as a society have today. This is about a man called Robert Henderson, who in 1995, 1995, he argued in an article in a cricket magazine that a nation, or as he called it, a Negro player, could never feel the same pride and identification with England as a white man. He added, there was a lot of racist bile that went with that, particularly addressed to you. And I believe people who supported your viewpoint were referred to by Henderson as liberal bigots, which is a rather unpleasant phrase as well. How did you feel about that whole episode? It must have, there must have been a lot of mental pressure on you, not least because you didn't seem to get much support from people who you would normally expect to have had some support from.
Yeah, I think the whole Henderson thing this was 1995. This was a very leading cricket magazine with a board, most distinguished board, including the then England cricket captain and so on. And the article was called "Is It in the Blood?" And to me it seemed, blatantly racist, should never have been published. And then Henderson started, I knew Henderson because he'd written a letter to me saying, that I didn't understand how the white were suffering because of the immigration of non-white people. And then he started writing letters to me, which he copied to my editor of the Telegraph and other people, describing me as human stool. And he said, looking at your face and brown colour and so on reminds me of, what you are and things like that. And what astonished me was, of course, he wrote these letters to me. A, the Telegraph didn't do anything, but B, there were very, very respected people who, of course, didn't know about these letters, but who did not see in his article, "Is It in the Blood?" and who was talking about biology, that this is not the point to debate identity. Identity is, you can debate identity, but not on the basis of biology and things like that. And that's a very dangerous path to take. And the fact that they couldn't see it, and these were very respectable people were friends of mine, one of them a very distinguished journalist and so on, and I was a bit surprised as to why they didn't see it, didn't see the dangerous thing. It's all very well to say about, and Voltaire says, I disagree with you, but I would defend to death your right to say it. But there's got to be a difference between who you're debating with. If you're debating, there can't be a debate between a Nazi concentration camp commander and the Jews he's trying to kill. There's no debate to be had. The debate must be on the basis that two people agree that there is some if you like, agreement between them about how to live and how to conduct themselves. And that was what worried me, that wasn't there.
Yeah. I can see that because, over, for example, Brexit, I have had good friends who I have debated and argued with, and we have remained total and good friends. I have had...
Not Nigel Farage.
No, there have been others who have found my views so unacceptable they've suggested I leave the country and go and live in France, which might have been addressed. But to return to Henderson, I agree with you that, given what the level of that abuse, that you can shut the mouth of racism. But it's a different matter when you don't actually shut the heart and mind of racists. And what is the way in which we can do that?
The only way to do that is education and the willingness to look at the past. And this willingness is often not there, because what has happened, and particularly in the Western world, and particularly in Europe, the feeling is the colonies have gone, the empire is over, forget the past, it's all in the past, it's all done and dusted. But the thing is, what exactly do you remember about the past, and what exactly was the past? We're in the middle of the 80th anniversary of D-Day, a great moment, a great event, vital for the final crushing of the Nazis. But how many people in this country would know that the turning point of the war was the Soviet victory at Stalingrad and for the land war? How many people would know that the European countries who had empires all went into the war defending their empire, that they didn't want to give their empire freedom? Now, those contradictions that were there are not very known to people. The idea would be, well, they wouldn't know that India was not a free country at that stage. India was also fighting for its own freedom. So these complexities of the past, if you're not prepared to accept it, I always give the example, again, because I suppose right in sport, is about the example of cricket, how cricket got originated in India, and Niloufar, though I don't think her knowledge of cricket is great or her interest in cricket is great, but her community played a huge part, the Parsis. But the tournament that started cricket going in India was called the Pentangular. There were 3 Indian teams, a Parsi team, a Hindu team, and a Muslim team. In fact, the Gymkhanas are still there in Mumbai along Marine Drive. As a kid, I used to go there often. And the other team was a British team called Europeans. The British in India called themselves Europeans. And while the Hindu-Muslim Parsis, obviously religious-based teams, the European team was of pure European blood. So therefore, this is how the British in India had a system of a race-based society. Now, if you don't accept that doesn't, you see what has happened with the past is, if people think, if the past has been unfortunate, if the past has had some very terrible events, by acknowledging the past, we have to apologize for the past. We have to differentiate between acknowledgement and apology. I can't apologize for the past, or what my ancestors did, but I must acknowledge what they did. And to give you an example from that, my ancestors come from Bengal, which is now Bangladesh. We were minority Hindu zamindars, they were called, landlords, lording it over the Muslim majority. I went back to the village where my family came from, where we were supposed to own the entire village and so on. They treated me and my wife very, very well. But they also told us that my ancestors had behaved badly, and they had oppressed the Muslims and so on. And I have to accept that is what they did. But I can't apologize for that. And this is where we're getting, we don't want to admit the past, because we feel by admitting the past, we'll have to apologize and pay reparations or things like that. And this is where it's getting complicated.
But it is, you're right, it is extremely complicated, but it's interesting how many prime ministers this country has had who've apologised for the actions of other people. It is not done to apologise for your own actions. But the acknowledgement is... But I can see the political problem in that if you acknowledge something, you are then being condemned for not apologising for it. So you then end up apologising for it, and it appears that the apology has been dragged out of you rather than made with a full heart and full spirit. So it is unfortunate that politics just makes what you're suggesting almost impossible.
Yes, and also you want the full history. Now, for instance, William Wilberforce is a very good example. William Wilberforce was a great champion to end slavery. Absolutely, no question about it. But the very speech he made in the House of Commons, saying that, slavery should be abolished, he also said, even more important than abolishing slavery, is sending missionaries to India because we want to convert the Hindus, which is an awful religion, which is the most awful religion on the earth. Now, if I mention that, am I being woke? No, but that is in his speech. Yes. You see, this is where the complexity and the need to explain history in all its ramifications is needed. And the problem is the history that has been written, that the world knows as history, has been written by the European. And the wider history is only now being, if you like, talked about. And I think much of the reaction in Europe, which I find, is that, oh no, this can't be true, or you're trying to make us feel guilty and things like that. It's not a question of making you feel guilty. It's not a question of guilt and gratitude. It's a question of just what exactly happened.
Yeah. I was lucky in that when I was at university, I was taught British imperial history by a South African, and so that brought a very different perspective. A white South African, but nonetheless a lady who had left South Africa because of apartheid. So she had a very clear view on the British. And yes, the thing is, we live in a diverse and complex world, and I do think, in fairness to many of the historians of not just the British Empire but all types of global politics, is that they do give a balance and a nuance. But what actually is the problem? It's seized upon, whether it's politicians, whether it's Christian people who have gone out to try and convert other countries, it is seized on and oversimplified. And it is the oversimplification of what are complex issues, which I'm afraid is probably has always been the blight of politics, but is particularly the blight of politics today. I mean, one thing, we were brought by a perfectly respectable taxi driver from Cambridge Station, but Mihir asked who he was going to vote for, and he said Reform, Farage is the man who has all the answers. So, I think that is a fairly simplified view of the world. Yeah, so I was going to say...
Sorry, what's your question?
My question, sorry. Yes, that it is the political world today, particularly today, which has distorted and oversimplified what historians have often written as a quite complicated and subtle subject.
Yes, but we are in a fluid situation still. I think, as I narrate in this book, the England I came in the 60s is not the England of today. It is a much more tolerant, much more aware society. When I came, for instance, the idea that Indian food would become the food of this country would have been considered laughable. It was considered blotting paper food. It's what you had after 12 pints of bitter later in the evening and you went to the restaurant. That was not the food, but it has now become. Chicken tikka masala actually hadn't been invented. I remember going to the first Indian restaurants I went to, chicken vindaloo was presented, and vindaloo actually is a Goan dish. It's not a dish which is central to India, and the reason was that the chefs in this country, the first chefs were Goans who are great seafarers and so on, and they cooked vindaloo, and everybody would ask me, is this the vindaloo that's real? And I would look at them and think, if you ask most people about vindaloo in India, they wouldn't know what you're talking about, And of course, again, societies are different. In India, in this country, even in Indian restaurants, it's starter, main course, sweet. But in India, that's not how food is served. In India, every dish is followed by, first you have vegetables, then you have fish, then you have chicken and meat, and so on and so forth, and it goes on. And in India, the race in a wedding feast is how many dishes you can serve. Can you serve 20, 30? Mind you, when I was growing up in India, soon after independence, there was ration cards and things like that, and you were not allowed to invite more than 50 people to a wedding. So what you would have, these great weddings in Taj Mahal Hotel, which is the great hotel in India, and you would only get an ice cream, and because that was the only thing they could be served. And actually those weddings were more like business deals. The couple would be sitting on a podium, and the friends, the business friends of the bride would come along and present envelopes with rupees in it, which was part of the transaction of marriage. The only wedding feast that were different to this was Parsi wedding feast, because they held it in the Agyari and they would have lovely food. The only thing was, at the end of the meal, as you were about to finish your dessert, people would line up behind you because there was such a big crowd there. But this was a different world to a certain extent. You see, I grew up in it's very hard to explain. We talk about a multicultural, diverse world, but I actually grew up in a very, very diverse world. My mother was devoutly Hindu, but she had a Muslim sage, and she sent me to a Jesuit school. In fact, one of the ayahs we had, the maid, who was a Goan, told my mother, if you go to St. Mary's in Bandra, which is the biggest church of St. Mary's in India, and offer candles, Meher will do very well at school. I don't know if she offered the right candles or not, but I didn't do that well at school. But anyway, the point is that my friends were Muslims. My teachers were mostly Parsis. One of them would make us study by heart these letters, where you write formal letters, Mr. and Mrs. Bose invite you to dinner and so on, and we had to learn it with the commas and things like that, and that sort of thing, and so that was the diverse. And yet, and I'll read a passage of that from my book, which will illustrate, when we had guests of my parents come, we would be invited, or I would be asked to come to the drawing room and touch their feet as a mark of reverence. And, they expected that, and they sort of, blessed you and so on. But sometimes, occasionally, it didn't work. And this happened when a real cousin, not an instant cousin, appeared. I, prepared to do it. I'd never seen him before, and until my father summoned me, I didn't even know he existed. The moment I emerged in the drawing room and saw him, I marched up to him and bent low to touch his highly polished shoes. He had not expected it, but once he realized what was happening, he did something I had not anticipated. He was sitting on the three-seater sofa that was my father's pride and joy, with his legs crossed. Seeing me bend down to try and touch his feet, he uncrossed his legs, spread them wide, bent down himself, and with both hands tried to push off my hands. I'd never experienced such resistance before. This was not part of the script, and I was determined not to give in. I spread myself wide like a goalkeeper facing an on rushing forward, and extending my arms on either side, tried to touch his shoes. By this time, he had raised his feet, and they were waving gently in space. He spread his hands, and our fingertips met. Also, in order to avoid my hands, he moved to the left, while I countered by moving to the right and tried to find a gap between his hands to reach the tips of his boot-black shoes. He countered by moving right, and I moved left. The game could have gone on endlessly had not Baba intervened and said, "That's enough." We were brought up in this sort of complex world. For instance, there is a David Sassoon library in Bombay. And who was David Sassoon? He was an Iraqi Jew who had come to Mumbai, and we had an Armenian church in Bombay, a very rich Armenian church. It was so rich that it wrote a letter to the Armenians in Lebanon saying, "We've got so much money, we don't know what to do. Do send us some students so that we can educate them." It was that sort of world. And when people talk of complexity here, it's a different kind of complexity. This is predominantly still a white country, nothing wrong with that, where the monarch is the head of the church and the head of the state. And the monarch is the head of the Anglican Church, and the monarch can't be a Catholic. Fortunately, the election results in India mean that India will not become a Hindu state, or at least I hope it won't. But the point is that Indian diversity was of a different kind to diversity here. I'm not saying one is superior to the other. I think this country is discovering diversity, and it's a slow process, it's a long process. It is happening. And what is happening is it's very, very encouraging. And what really encourages me is that this country has a capacity to come together. And I always feel that when I go past the Houses of Parliament. What you have there, inside the Houses of Parliament, there's a statue of Cromwell. Now, Cromwell was the man who beheaded a king, and yet he's there inside the Houses of Parliament, and every time the monarch goes to the House, he will have passed the statue of Cromwell. So in a way there's reconciliation, but to have real proper reconciliation, we need a much more acceptance of what happened in the past. And that, I think, is a slow process, and there is resentment of that happening.
And that is clearly happening now at the moment, where we are. I suspect that there is a crisis to come, where you have the two polarised sides will meet each other in a great confrontation. You will have the people like our taxi driver who wants to remove most immigration, and you will have also on the other a lot of as you know my son extremely well. He married a lady of Indian heritage, and so I now have a stake in that game because I want my grandchildren to have every opportunity, and I don't want them to have anything to do with racists or any other type of people who will hold them back. So do you think we have a battle still to come, or do you think it is just an incremental process?
I think we still have a battle to come, and I think immigration will be a big issue, because I think what has changed from 1969 is 1969-70 when I came, people would declare, like the landlady said, sorry, my husband wouldn't like an Indian in the house. Now nobody wants to be a racist. Now nobody is a racist, or nobody would admit is a racist, and yet those feelings are there. And that takes a long time to get over, and and that sort of to bridge the gap, if you like, is a slow process, and that requires acceptance on both sides as to where we are coming from and how far we can go in bridging it. I mean, you don't want cultures to be submerged into one pot. No, you want cultures to thrive and feel that they can still thrive and prosper and be equal.
But you see, one thing that is...
Could you stop Q&A now?
Yes, absolutely. I'll stop now. Yes, I've talked. Would you... any questions from... Anyone has any questions?
We've bored them.
We've bored them. Look, if you don't let... Can I have one last question? If no one has one last question then to you. What I suppose has shocked me about this election campaign is that, particularly when we saw Sunak and Starmer debating last night, when they were debating about immigration, their whole debate was about how to control immigration. No one has, in this election campaign, has actually stood out and said, immigration is a great thing, it adds significantly to our country, it makes it a much better, more civilised place. And I find it slightly shocking that no one has actually done that.
Well, the thing is that, first of all, immigration has been a curious post-war phenomenon in this country. I see it as the last impact of the empire. In 1948, the Nationality Act was passed, opening the doors to people from the subcontinent and the Caribbean coming, and we know about the Windrush generation. There's a lot been written about it. And what happened then was the immigrants who came from the Indian subcontinent were actually from the poorer part of India. They were from the agricultural part. Most of them didn't know English. Of course, many of them had actually not lived under British rule, because half the Indian population was ruled by the Indian princely states and so on. And then we had a second wave of immigration, and this is, of course, Rishi Sunak's generation. They came from East Africa and so on, and they changed the face of Indian or Asian migration, but the other face of immigration hasn't changed. And now we have people coming from different parts of the world, and there is a lack of knowledge of why these people are coming. And some of them are coming, places like Afghanistan, Libya and so on, because of liberal Western intervention in those countries. And people here don't accept that. They think what we did was a good thing, or they even don't know what we did. So they're suddenly thinking, why are these people coming, and why are they coming in this way, and things like that. And of course the whole business of Europe, because I personally think this country has not got over the fact that it won the Second World War and lost the empire. That is a fact that nobody has explained to them. That you won one battle, but you lost a greater war. And that how it happened is something that most people are quite ignorant about. And unless there is awareness and knowledge about that, I'm not sure we're going to move forward. At an individual level, we've moved immensely forward in the way Indian food, culture, and the way that, West Indian music and things like that, we've moved immensely forward, much further than I could have imagined in '69, but not on the wider sphere of how the society looks at itself and where it's going.
Thank you, Mihir. That has been absolutely brilliant. You have lived up to your billing. This is his 53rd book, but actually the most significant one was his 41st book, because that was the moment at which he could say that he had written more books than he dropped catches off my bowling at the cricket.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. We're deeply grateful to both of you for this very valuable and insightful exchange. You talked about immigration, and this is really what the theme of the discussion was. People in the United Kingdom have forgotten that immigration is not a novelty. The Vikings were immigrants. The Romans were immigrants in 55 BC. The Hanoverians were immigrants. And I remember a time when Notting Hill was an immigrant enclave. And then became, with the Notting Hill carnivals, etc., and was sort of transformed. I'm reminded when I was a student, and please don't misunderstand, my landlady was in Streatham. And one day she came back and complained about the black conductors. And she said, I can't tell you, I don't want to travel on buses anymore. So I said, why, Mrs. Remington? And she said, well, they smell something awful. So I said, Mrs. Hard, you do realize that I'm black as well. And she looked at me and she said, oh no, dear, no, not you. You're what I would call off-white. So it's a question of how far white or black you are on the scale. But let me, and before I forget, Pushpinderji and Chanji, you had been kind enough to sponsor the tea, the coffee, and I was a little negligent, I should have acknowledged it earlier, but nevertheless, I hope you're still enjoying it. Somebody was asked, how was your lunch? And they said, I'm enjoying it, but that was about 4 hours ago. Yesterday I ate then, but I'm enjoying it now. So I hope you're enjoying your tea and coffee. But thank you, and let me just now wind up by asking Rahul to say a few words and conclude what has been an exciting and productive KSLF.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'd particularly like to thank Dr. Yusuf Hamied, who's had to go because of prior commitment, but I'd like to thank him for making this event possible in the theatre which is named after him. And I also noticed there's a new building that's come up in this college, which is also named after him and funded by him. There's an example of, we're talking about immigration, some example of an immigrant who came and studied here and who's contributed to this country a great deal. I'd also like to mention about you talking about Indian food and things like that. I remember in my college days, when I was here studying here, there was complaints about the food that was being served in Indian restaurants was dog food. And then somebody noticed that, maybe what they thought, we have this made from yogurt or curd called lassi. And lassi was the name of a dog, which was in films in those days. So maybe the confusion is because lassi is being served here, and it spelled exactly like that, Lassi, lassi. Anyway, that's on a lighter side. But I'd also like to thank, again, he has had to go, is Lord Simon MacDonald for hosting us here also. And Eastern Eye newspapers which are here, which have been our media partners for this event. Well, there are all these other people who are there who've helped us, and I had mentioned them earlier at London, so I don't think I need to mention them, but I'd like to mention Fakir Ijazuddin, who's been our compere here as well as in London, one of our closest friends and associates, and we're hoping he'll come year after year here. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Yes, Arts Council of England has also helped us here. Yusuf and Farida Hamied Foundation, SOAS, which hosted us in London, Christ College, where we are now, Mayfair Hotel, which I had mentioned, Cobra Beer, which is Lord Billimoria's beer, Grow More Trees, Piparan, Prabhu is somewhere around, I think, selling books there, Prabhu Guptara, 1469, which is our partner in the bags that some speakers have received, are 1469, University of Cambridge alumni, Tongues on Fire, Chan and Pushpinder who are there, who's actually, Ejaz already mentioned them, but I'd like to mention them again. Thank you very much. And they've been associated with us right from the beginning. Thank you very much. Yes, I mentioned Eastern Eye, and the audience. Mustn't forget the audience. Okay. And that's all our people from all over. You know, we have it in Kasoli also. We've been having this Lit Fest. It started off in Kasoli 13 years ago. And Kasoli, as you probably know, is a small cantonment station up in the Himalayas. And that's where my father did much of his writing, in Kasoli. Well, again, thank you again for joining us. And see you again next year, hopefully, at Christ College.